So I think in Brian's survey, I'm one of those people that I love seeing deer, but I worry about the problems that they cause because we see them every day. And as I was mentioning in some of the questions before, it really varies regionally. Okay, so we're going to start with just a little bit about Maryland's forests. We're in the Mid-Atlantic. If you don't cut it or mow it, what happens in Maryland? We grow trees for the most part, most places. So we are predominantly forested natural ecosystem. We are currently 37% forest. If you're looking at the U.S. Forest Service definition of forest, so sort of an acre or more of contiguous forest. A lot of the state, oak hickory is really our dominant type. It was based on historic fire regime. The characteristics of the oaks, their thicker bark, and the fact that they put, when they're little, they put all their energy into their root system. And so they're not putting those sprouts up really, really fast. They're investing in their roots. So it was a great growth strategy when we had periodic wildfire. Very successful. That's what, a lot of our ecosystems are really, that's what they're based on, is that oak hickory forest. So from the standpoint of habitat, there's a lot of values associated with that habitat, not only for deer. It's really important winter food source for deer and a lot of other mammals, but also for the birds, migratory birds, local birds, and then it also ties in with water quality. Oak forests, if you're looking at what is coming out of an oak hickory dominated watershed, you're going to have lower values than, say, a maple beech birch watershed. Both of them will still be very low in comparison to pretty much any other land use. But there is some difference between those species dominations in terms of water quality. So I mentioned the birds and this association with insects. So it's not that the birds are necessarily eating the leaves, they're eating what eats the leaves. And that's a lot of our insects. And if you have not read Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home, it is an entomologist's viewpoint of why do our native plants matter? And one of his chapters is, what does bird food look like? And so as an entomologist, there's lots of pictures of insects, which are really cool. But he's communicating in a way that ties it to some of the things that non-entomologists care about in a way that I have seen few entomologists do. This is just looking basically at the difference between our native woody vegetation and non-native species in terms of the number of, that's just the caterpillar species. But that is that link between why do we care whether we have native trees rather than just something that's green and pretty. Because the impact of that spirals up through that whole natural system. And that's why we care whether we have a native tree versus some of the other things that are coming into our landscape now. So this is a little excerpt from one of our recent forest inventory and analysis reports. U.S. Forest Service does annual inventory. About every 6 years, we get a complete re-up of our panel. They're doing like a portion of that every year. So anyway, this is basically saying the gray is growth. The orange is harvest, and the blue is mortality that's not harvest. So, and this is based on volume. So you can see that overall, generally we are growing a whole lot more than is taken away. And when I was given this kind of talk 10 years ago, I was pointing at the red maple and saying, we have a lot of really old oak and a lot of really young red maple. I'm not quite sure what's going on out there, but there's a lot more mortality in the red maple than there used to be. There it is. There's a lot more holly on the eastern shore, but the consistent thing between 10 years ago and now is that we have fewer young oak trees. So, why is that? Well, we've settled the landscape. Maryland Forest Service works really hard to control a lot of those wildfires so that, we can live on that landscape. But it's pushing a shift towards thinner bark species. Think red maple, think the gums, sweet gum, black gum. Deer populations. They may be stable for, a statewide level, but there are regions of our state where it sure feels like they are higher and even more impact than we would have had 10 or 15 years ago. There's other portions of the state where there's enough hunting pressure that you see forest regeneration in the woods. So what's changing? Why do we have fewer oaks? Fire suppression. More deer than was our historic norm for the regeneration of our forests. And then invasive species, both from our agricultural systems and our landscaping. So some parts of the state you see more agricultural invasives, some parts of the state you see more of the landscaping escapees. And we're doing less harvesting too, and we're doing more partial harvesting, and some of that lack of light, oaks can be shade tolerant, but they still grow slower, have less vigor if you don't have a lot of good sunlight in those early years. So for the forest, we really do look at deer as a keystone species. Just take a look at the layers in this forest here inside the exclosure versus outside. So just take a look at that. That's up in, I think, Cecil County. And so what's going on? What's the difference? All you did is keep out the deer. So you got the same weather, you got the same seed source, you got the same birds, squirrels, mice, whatever. But you see a really different understory, and we'll get to the regeneration issue in a minute. So we basically just get fewer seedlings for the next forest. The invasive species, a lot of times they're there because the deer do not like them. So they're selecting our future forest, and it's not our native forest. There's one of the, when we were trying to look at the effect of deer on forests, we looked at some of the old Maryland National Capital Park and Planning deer exclosures, and I'll show you some information from that in a minute. But I don't think I'll ever forget, us going around trying to find the old deer exclosures, and we're in a van and trying to figure it out, going along, encounter the park naturalist, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I know right where that is." that's where we take the kids to see the spring wildflowers. Because in my Stream Valley Park, I don't have them anywhere else. And that's what you see with, the trillium, the lady slippers. Now, Jack in the Pulpit is still hanging in there because apparently the deer don't like them too much. So we'll still see Jack in the Pulpit out there, but well, that they are one of the wildflowers that I see in places where a lot of other things are gone. But I think that point right there is the story of Central Maryland. When they are hungry, they will eat anything, and there is no such thing as deer resistant. But then that gets to our population levels. So just moving through, we've, wildlife habitat quality, the niches associated with different layers. And there's a lot of research out there relating some of the deer impacts on songbirds, particularly those ones that are inhabiting the layers that sort of go away when there's a lot of deer browse impact. And we talked some about the water quality impacts where we see those species shifts. The other point to think about is when we're looking at forest and water quality functions, a lot of the water quality functions are really keyed into just biomass. How much plant matter is sitting there, cycling things, making things into, healthy organic systems and not free nutrient additions. So the more biomass you have, generally the more effect you're having on water quality. Okay, so this is one of the early studies that was just looking at songbirds and ground cover and fairly direct correlations to deer density. I think this tends to be where people use as targets for carrying capacity. Brian, does that look reasonable to you? I know I hear everything from 15 to 25. Right. So I want to go back to the watershed. My background is as a forest hydrologist. Some of the work that we do is looking at reservoir forests and what does it look like when your forest is sustainable or resilient? We love those words. They sound great. But what does it look like on the ground? What does that forest look like? And so we talk about, it's a forest that can kind of resist disturbances, not go away when there's a major disturbance. And then when there is the kicker storm or something that does happen, what's its capacity to spring back from that and get back to the functions that it's been given you? So what do we look at? We look at diversity, not just in species, but also in age, so that it's not just all one-aged forest that's going to react similarly to a storm or some other event. And we're looking for layers, that more complex structure. And we're looking for where are those seed sources or the advanced regeneration that the oaks need for the future forest. So this is a combination of forest inventory plots from both Baltimore and WSC reservoirs. Guess which one had more hunting? So this is basically saying that at the Reservoir Forests in Baltimore, Loch Raven, Liberty, and Pretty Boy, over 70% of the plots had no forest regeneration. That is not what we are looking for when we are looking for a resilient forest. And Tridelphia and Rocky Gorge are the WSSC reservoirs. So, and they had more of a hunting, a longer term hunting program there. Yeah, I haven't looked at it yet. Right. That was 2001. Yeah, and actually those exclosures have basically grown over with invasive plants and are no longer monitored. No, which is the other part of the story, which is where we're going. But there is newer data there that's looking at sort of effects following some small harvests, and that's what we haven't analyzed yet. So we don't necessarily have a continuation, but you can sort of see the difference between the bow-hunted and the non-hunted in just a minute here. Again, the older data. So the Patuxent, the WSSC reservoirs, you can see, we looked at sort of what layers are there. And even though they had some regeneration, they still had, less of some of this shrub layer that would be browsed, that there's still definite deer impacts there. So in the interest of time, I don't know that we need to go into a lot of the details. Just suffice it to say there's some pretty different methods, but they were consistent during the time that they were measured. In this, you can see the stilt grass outside of the exclosure and not inside. I don't know exactly why, but I saw it multiple places. Where that Stream Valley Park, where the naturalist was saying, oh yeah, that's where the spring wildflowers are. There was no stilt grass when those exclosures went in. 10 years later, they carpeted most of that area. These areas have changed a lot over 10 and 15. Yeah. So one of the things that we're looking at with these reservoir forests is not just how many woody stems are there, but are we getting our native forests back? And so one of the things that we broke out, and you could really see the browse effects from between the exclosures. I mean, it still bounces around really depending on, the seed crop year and how wet it is when the seedlings are germinating. Huge variation year to year, and, most of the seedlings that get started don't end up, surviving. But you still get a lot every year. A lot of potential regeneration out there still, even in these heavily browsed forests, because you still have the seed source coming. But they're, going away when they're getting browsed. When you look at all the woody stems, like we did here, it's a lot less clear, the browse effects. And again, so that's Loch Raven at a time when it was not even hunted. So I think that's another point to keep in mind. We have significant impacts, particularly in the central Maryland area, but there is still tremendous regeneration potential out there if you give it a chance. And the other place that you start, so there was browse effect that we could see when we were looking mostly at oaks, one of our target species. And then if you're looking at things that are starting to get that survive that first year and are getting into multiple years of survival, they're a little more stable, and there's also a larger effect between browsed and unbrowsed. And here's where you can see So this is all species, but the little larger ones. So LR is Loch Raven at a time when there wasn't even bow hunting or the shooting. So you can see that it was really the lowest levels. And that was sort of the effect. The other reservoirs, there's bow hunting only, right? Is that still the case? And are they still sharp shooting in the lower portion of Loch Raven? Yeah, like by the golf course and stuff like that. Yeah. So anyway, you can walk into the woods and you can say, boy, there's a lot of deer here. And there are, there's inventory methods where that are regional in nature, but it really captures, you have this species, you don't have that species, and it helps you estimate the level of deer impact by just looking at the composition that's left. And we've already talked about Japanese stilt grass, but here are these Maryland National Capital Park and Planning parks, and you can see that there's just massive density outside of it. And I was trying to figure out whether it's, the deer hoof impact. I don't know. Is there any soil mixing? But you have, so there's a bunch of different mechanisms between, so it's there. But then invasive species, it's a changing game. I mean, things change over decades in terms of what we see. Japanese honeysuckle was a new invasive like in the 20s, 30s. The deer have gotten used to eating it. They have learned to like it. So that's one of the things in the exclosures that we have followed for like 10 years. It gets overtaken with some of these things that get released from browsing that are still invasive plants. So the answer is not just to control the deer. It's not the only thing, right? So you've got to really look holistically at, I think if you have lower deer pressure, it gives the natives a chance so that when you do your other invasive control efforts, that you can get occupancy by the native communities that you're looking for. So you got to keep all those pieces of the ecosystem in mind when you're looking at how to manage this. Things like Oriental bittersweet, the literature, some literature will say, oh, the deer really love to browse the Oriental bittersweet. Others will say, oh, it doesn't touch it. I don't see it being browsed a whole lot. I mean, do people see it being browsed? So one of the things we saw when we did exclosures is stuff like spice bush. You saw these spice bush browse to nubbins, and you're like, these are some hungry deer. Yeah. So anyway, this is our new ecology. So when people say, well, why can't we just let nature take its course? Nature's taking a different course because of the things that we have done on the landscape. We have taken away fire, we have added invasives, and our development patterns are such that our deer are at a different balance. They, in portions of our state, they're at a level that's really basically not allowing our forests to do normal, natural forest regeneration. So Jonathan wanted me to cover something about some of the tree planting challenges and costs. So I've got a couple slides on this. When we did a big survey in about 2000 of what's really affecting seedling survival, the number one thing is really vegetative competition. That root competition, the light competition. These were heavy drought years then. Drought was significant as well. But the next big thing was deer browse. And the trend that we have seen among our foresters, mostly statewide, but particularly in the central region, is increasing use of tree tubes. So the tree tubes, we used to use 4-foot tree tubes, and they went to 5-foot tree tubes. Now we have people that want to recommend 6-foot tree tubes. I mean, the deer getting taller. I think the deer are getting, in places, more desperate. Jamie Weaver did a slide, and he had a deer with a giraffe neck on it or something like our deer. But anyway, what we are responding to is the fact that we're not seeing survival with some of these shorter tree tubes, even though it protects the buds down in here. It's just got to get a good year to get up above the deer and have the survival. And then the other thing that a lot of people don't think about is the buck rub. That even some of the older trees, you can really do a number. If they really work at it, they can girdle a tree. You don't usually see that, but it's also a place for entrance for other insects and disease. So this is sort of some of the types of installations that we use with the tree tube, the bird net, and one coming out. Done a lot of research on tree shelters at Natural Resources, the Monocacy Natural Resources Management Area. And these are some of our costs from last year's plantings. So our seedlings are around $1. So we can usually plant seedlings for about $500 an acre if we plant 435 trees per acre for like a buffer planting. But the tubes and the stakes and the installation are, 7 times that. So you can do the math and say, okay, we went from $500 to, $3,500 an acre. Fencing is the other means that we use. This is some of the by species results of some of the difference. The fencing and shelters both work pretty well. Green ash, not going to use that right now, but it was one of our major species before emerald ash borer, but it really liked fencing even more than shelters. It's one of the faster growing species that gets out of shelters very quickly. Oaks stay in their shelters much longer. Black walnut, again, something that is a little bitter tasting, not as preferred, but will get browsed. And you can really see, you can see the impact. Hailu Chiru at Monocacy also looked at, fencing. And the break-even point that he found was about 3 acres. It can really vary depending on configurations. Under 3 acres, tree tubes will be less expensive. Over 3 acres, fencing would be an option. I know if you start fencing really large areas, it gets things out of whack for the deer movement. But we don't usually have that large a regeneration areas that we worry about that. So just to wrap up, we see really direct impacts in the forests, both for the ecology, wildlife habitat, water quality, interactions with invasive species, and particularly tree regeneration. And if you have the deer impacts for a long time, it can sort of take that cohort out. And it can take much longer to recover naturally if it's really been an impact for a long time. Our forests still look pretty good out there because they're long-lived. We have options. But the longer that we go without doing something about it, without really paying attention to forest management over the long term, the fewer options we have, the more expensive they become. And so that's where we are. And so hopefully we can talk more another time about forest management and what options there would be. So, questions?